Hello, everyone. Welcome to this I3h seminar. My name is Michael Casanira. I'm a senior researcher there. And it's a great honor for me today to introduce Antonio ESTACHE. Antonio, beyond being a colleague here at ULB, Antonio is one of the great minds that we have the pleasure of interacting with. His amazing experience and knowledge makes him a true economist's economist. In his spare time, he's also an incredibly cultivated and avid reader, and I actually understand that he's using part of his spare time to become an historian of sorts. Closer to the matters of the day, Antonio graduated in economics from ULB in 1980, started working at ULBA, then went to the IMF in 1981, and started working for the World Bank in 1982, where he spent a big part of his career. He traveled the world. He decided to engage in a master at the University of Maryland because the full-time job at the World Bank was not enough. He kept traveling the world. He developed infrastructure, that is, he brought water, electricity, sanitation, healthcare, et j'en passe, to the people who needed it the most. Doing so, he became a two-sided expert, therefore an economist on many topics, including privatizations, incentives, public-private partnerships, and so on. Beyond infrastructure, he was confronted to several health crises, including cholera and AIDS in Latin America, and through that experience, learned how to manage epidemics. But this is not enough for Antonio, so he needed to be a bit busy beyond that. And so he decided to also engage in a PhD, which he completed at ULB in 1995. And he kept publishing hundreds of articles. So I went to the Google Scholar, which lists 20 articles per page. And Google Scholar announces 20 such pages. So his articles are cited more than 11,000 times. And I can tell that his influence goes well beyond the citation. So by any metric, this is just beyond extraordinary. And I want to thank Antonio for accepting to present today. As I said, it's an honor. And so we are very much happy to listen to you talking about what pharma ownership means for its optimal regulation.
Wow. Very, very kind words, and the honor is mine actually to be there with you. Please apply a large discount rate to whatever is said. It seems to make more sense to me. So the main idea now is to share with you some of the impressions that I've gathered by looking at a sector I did not know much about. And so the idea is to make you think about some things that maybe you haven't really thought about for some time. So the main question is anchored into the way the big pharmas are financing their business. It's quite interesting to note, by the way, that the way big pharmas finance and small pharmas do that is quite different. So I want to emphasize that what I'm talking about is about big pharmas. I want to talk about the financial performance implications of their financing decision. I want to talk about the operational implication, the regulatory implication, and most importantly, I want to make sure that I don't, that you see that I don't do this just for the fun of doing it, but I do it because I think it has economic and social implications. If regulation fails to do the right thing in these dimensions, actually, there are consequences. We'll talk a little bit about that because there's not a lot of evidence so far. Okay, so it's important to think about the need to account explicitly for the effects of ownership and financing decisions in this sector, just like it was for me in electricity, or if it was for transport or for water sector where I worked before. So most of the illustrations I'll be talking about are based on an assessment of the French market. It's very preliminary, and please keep in mind also that I come at this from a very specific sector, which is infrastructure. It's much more finance-oriented than pharma, and maybe the regulation in the sector is a lot more advanced than in pharma because we've had to deal with the financing constraints a lot earlier than maybe pharma. Just to give you a feeling right now of where the financing and the sector comes from. So this comes from Damodaran, who's a professor of finance at NYU, and he has an amazing database for those of you interested in this kind of stuff. And if you look at, these are the health-related sectors that he covers, for instance, and the key column, of course, is the yellow one, and it shows you the relative importance in equity, in the stocks that the people that these firms have, the relative importance of institutional players, so pension funds, hedge funds, investment funds of different types. So you see that in Europe, it's a little bit less than the US, but you see it's quite significant. And if you think about the stocks that the CEO holds and the other higher level staff in these companies, roughly, 50 to 60% of the equity is controlled right now by these players, and about a third to 40 to 50%, maybe in the case of the US, is controlled by institutional players. So it's quite a significant dimension, and we know that these people have a very different type of horizon. They have different constraints than the government would have, if these firms were actually public firms. So let's look at what this means in practice. So you see these numbers again, they're quite high, they're quite significant. And they have really become an important financing source for the sector, no matter the database that you look at. And again, please keep in mind that these are averages. If you look at the number of firms that, for instance, he has for Europe, it's 222 firms. So these are averages, and they underestimate the actual values for large firms. Big money. If you look at 2000, these people had payouts about $30 billion, and in 2018 they had payouts of about 5 times as much. So this is a big source of revenue for these companies. So they have a very strong incentive to do a bunch of things that helps them. And what we know, and there's a lot of research right now that's growing up, not in pharma, but in many other activities. There are only 4 or 5 papers right now for the pharma sector. What we know is that when we look at the pharma evidence, it's quite consistent with evidence we have for the other sector, and it does make a difference in terms of financing and the expenditure decisions. And these decisions are quite important. They're all of interest to anybody working in health-related activities. It makes a difference to the way firms invest in research and development. It makes a difference on the relative importance of financing research and development versus financing the purchase of patents, for instance, intangible, or efforts to acquire competitors or small firms actually who are coming up with very nice products at the end of the testing phase. So these firms do have a role to play when the pharma industry actually makes those decisions. It makes a big difference in the way they're negotiating prices, and it makes a big difference in the decision to diversify the business. So there is a before and after when you think about the role of those firms along these 3 dimensions and many more, but these 3 are we're starting to have some evidence at that level. So why would I worry as a regulator? So if I think about this kind of thing, I'm looking at a very important industry. Health is crucial, and I know there is some problem in terms of concentration of power, and have big players with a lot of negotiating power. So why would I worry? Well, I worry because in any regulated industry, the operational and the financing decisions are easily used as adjustment variables in the computation of profit margins. So, this is, for instance, in my business, in regulated infrastructure services, a big part of the challenge is to go through the cost accounting of these firms, because firms do play games. And so you need to dig into the details. We're not going to go through this presentation, but it's something that I find quite interesting, that when I try to get detailed data on pharma, I don't have access to that. And in infrastructure, for instance, we can require the firms to provide us with the data. So that's one interesting difference.
If I may?
Sorry?
If I may,
yeah.
One thing that struck me, pharma is one of the most innovative industries. So about 15% of the sales goes to research and development, but another 15% used to be going to advertising, promotion, visiting doctors and so on. And that was data from 10, 15 years ago. And suddenly the accounting standards changed, that it's now included in some more general expenditure category. So it's becoming actually increasingly more opaque over time.
We agree. I think about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when they did the first assessment, that nobody thought about it. They were spending 9 times more on marketing than on research and development. And if you look at the partial data available right now, it's about 50-50. But these are accounting games, and I think, and frankly, it's not cheating. It's just playing games that the system allows them to play. And that's part of the problem. In infrastructure, for instance, we have regulatory guidelines which force these firms actually to be most transparent about accounting. I don't see that in pharma. I just don't see that. So that's one thing maybe that no, we'll talk about at the end of the presentation, because it's part of the changes that I would think would make sense for this sector. So once the pricing rule has been negotiated with the regulator, you know what the price is, and then just figure out with your cost accounted data how you can play in order to be able to adjust different types of costs, rebalance things over time within different types of categories, because that's how you play to adjust your actual profit margin. And this is why one of the things we'll talk about later in the presentation, you can see such a big difference between the return on equity, which is quite high for investors, and quite reasonable for the return on assets. So you'll see how this game can be played. And I worry about this because if any of these firms also dominates the market, right? They have strong market power in which, that if these firms are there, the high rate of return on equity can be correlated with a bunch of things which I know from theory and from practice. It may simply mean that I have too high a price, or I'm not supplying the market well enough. I'm restraining the access to the medication so that the price will go up one way or another, right? And this is quite brutal for the industry you guys are working on. So, and this risk increases actually with the degree of concentration of market power, and maybe with the changes in the number and types of investors. So that's one of the things we want to dig in, right? These are fair questions. We don't have a lot of evidence. We have partial evidence, and I think it's important that we continue accumulating on those things. But the risks, as I said, are quite significant, and they're quite highly correlated with a bunch of things that economists are not too bad at measuring, but need to get better at, as you will see in a few minutes, okay? So that's the main focus here. So,
Antonio, may I interrupt you just for 1 second for those who are listening, just to make things clear? When you mention regulators, that's a broad definition. In the pharma sector, at least in Europe, the regulator is not a player in the commercial negotiation. It has no impact at all on pricing. Pricing comes later after negotiation with each national government, just to make things clear.
Thank you very much. So just to make sure that it's also clear on my side, my regulators do not always control prices. In France, for instance, for distribution for electricity, the regulator makes a recommendation to the state and the state decides. In England, it's the other way around. We get the policy decision made at the government level, but then the implementation of those things are supervised and implemented by a regulator. And as you will see at the end, one of the questions that I would ask myself, but I'll come to build the case for that, is maybe there is a case in this kind of industry for a regulator that has an explicit opinion about whether the price is right or not. Because, I am frankly not convinced that many of the people who are participating in a negotiation do pay attention to all of those things in a very detailed way. And the access to information is increasing so fast that it's increasingly easy to play accounting games. This is a job. It's a profession. It's a job that people have to be able to do. And so if we go if we give up too fast on those sort of issues, well, we do pay the consequences in terms of investment, for instance, the composition of investment and stuff like that. So we will see that as we build it up. So if
Matthias had a question?
Yeah.
I may on this to kind of to make sure we are all on the same page. So I would think that in pharma, often people who think regulator, they think FDA, EMA, which is the authorization agency. You don't talk about that here. There are, however, it's a market where there is a lot of public intervention also. And in a sense, your regulator might be more something like the social security system that is negotiating the price and the reimbursement rule of these drugs, and they have to trade off the price they accept with the probability of being supplied, because we know that this is we know that the lower price markets get delayed introduction of new products. And finally, there is room for a competition authority to see whether prices may be too high. And I guess you are, in a sense, what you're saying is more relevant for the second and third. So the the social security system that discusses prices, and the competition authority. We are not talking today about the authorization agency, which is based on health costs and benefits. So life years saved versus risk of negative side effects. Thank you.
We agree. We agree, but there's one thing, and this is going to take us too far in the discussion of regulation, maybe, and less on what I want to talk about. But as a regulator in electricity, for instance, or in water and sanitation, for water and sanitation, maybe the easiest, the closest example for you. The water standards are not defined by the regulator of the sector. They're defined by the environmental regulators, for instance. And so we take this as an input, and then we look at the extent to which we can price the investment required to be able to cater to the standards imposed by the environmental agency. So we put a price on everything indeed, but the standards are defined by another agency, and we just figure out how to comply with those things, and then to see how fast we want to do it and stuff like that. And that's a negotiation also with the sector, actually, in general. So that's, indeed, I mean, we're more social security and we're more competition agency in many ways, but we do have standards that we have to think about, which are being provided also by an independent source of decision-making process and evaluation of what the standards should be.
And if I may interrupt again, you have some price regulation when a new drug comes on the market with the healthcare systems, mutual or whatever, depending on the country. But then a trick that the companies use is to go to sell that to a generic company, because when the drug becomes generic at the end of the life cycle, you lose some of this regulation. And you can actually observe sometimes price increases when the patent expires. Or they sell their monopoly to another firm, which will sell it as a generic. So basically, they want to get out of the regulated market to increase the prices when they see it works.
Yeah, and that's part of the games which are being played, and the extent to which you allow outsourcing of decision making on prices and stuff like that is part of the challenge that the regulator would have to think about. I mean, we probably have less problems in infrastructure than you have in the drug industry, but it's just an illustration of the creativity of the industries to be able to increase the profit margins. So let me just go on the profit margin. So if I look at the data and I see a very high return on equity and I see a very high profit margin, it can mean, and I'm repeating because I think it's important that we keep in mind that we don't have enough competition, that we have excessive prices, that we have rationed quantities. And on this one, actually, I think it's important you keep in mind it's a very static and dynamic story. That when you have rationed quantities, it may be that the investment decisions of the past were not the right one. And we may have quality of production and delivery, which are too low. So these indicators are quite correlated. So my return on equity or my profit margin, there's data for both of these variables. We can correlate them to these other 4 dimensions in general. But it's important, as you'll see, to do it in a very precise way. All of this stuff means that, from a social perspective, from a social welfare perspective, the way the economists talk about this kind of stuff, it may mean that some patients will have no access to products because we didn't control the return on equity or the profit margin, that some patients will not be able to afford the product, and that maybe subsidies, and in many ways subsidies are part of the game in this one, go to people in a very discriminate and specific way, which is not necessarily fair and not necessarily ethical either. So these are the consequences of not controlling these dimensions. That's what the regulator would probably have to think about. At least if I was assigned the job, this is how I would think about these sort of issues. So if I want to do that in a much more brutal way, is that the high health payoffs that we all hope from research and development in the sector and the matching subsidies may not be distributed as effectively and as fairly as we want. And this is simply because nobody has been mandated to look at the implications of financing choices. And it's, again, this is not something that I'm coming up just from theory. There's some theory, for those of you interested, Spiegel and Cambini, for instance, and various authors have been talking about this sort of stuff. But it's important to think that at some point somebody would have to look at the entry of institutional investors in a sector and the extent to which this is sort of impacting the choices, because it does influence the production decision and the pricing choices. And not just the average price, but also the price discrimination opportunities that you have within the sector. This is well documented, for instance, for the water sector. It's increasingly well documented for the energy sector as well. And it would be quite cool, actually, to be able to look at this in more details. I don't see why pharma would be that different on some of these dimensions. I mean, they're all quite rational. If I were advising the pharma companies, I would tell them to go along those lines. So, but I work more on the other side of the negotiation, and so I'm more concerned at taking a look at what these people are doing to be able to see whether it's good or bad. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this kind of stuff. As I said, I want to talk about France. France is not, it's not a huge market, but in Europe, it's not a small one. It's a slow-growing market. I mean, Japan is one of the slowest-growing market in many ways. The revenue is about 50 billions. About 10% goes for research and development. They have about 100,000 people. About 20% of those workers are working in research and development. So it's an interesting market to look at, also because there is some data on that market that I couldn't find for other markets. So let's see at the role of the financial actors, right? And to be able to look at it, it's no longer that interesting to look at the big picture. Actually, it's a lot more interesting to look at it per product type. So I decided to focus again, because of data constraints and opportunities, on pain treatment, on respiratory tract infection treatments, on digestive health, and on blood sugar monitoring. So these are my 4 sectors. And I will look at it in a very systematic way. I'm taking you along my investigation, I guess. I want to see who the top producers are, and I want to see who owns the top producers for each of these 4 products. All right. So that's the big picture that comes across when you dig with the data. Open Health company is the main source of the data for this kind of stuff. So I just put on the first column the overall pharma market, and then I put pain treatment, respiratory tract infection treatment, digestive health, and blood sugar monitoring at the end. Okay, and you see that you can, if you just look at if you take a rule of thumb, which is who is controlling over 5% of the share of the market, I put them in red so that gives you a sense. You see that one of the markets, I mean, you have lots of players with more than 5%, but for the blood sugar monitoring market, for instance, you see that you have a fairly high, strong concentration, at least if you take a quick look at the data. So that's one thing. So the first impression is the following one. We have a number of players. If you look at the name of the players, which are predictable: Novartis, Sanofi, Milan, Servier, Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Roche, and all those people are quite predictable. But at this point, I mean, we can only draw the following conclusion from a first look at the table. I haven't used any technical tool to be able to look at that kind of stuff in detail, but I know from just looking at this stuff that if I look at the overall market, I'm not too worried about concentration, which is also, if you look at the annual report of the pharma lobby, which are all very useful very often, this is also what they tend to argue. Why worry about so much? If you look at us in a big picture, we're not a big problem. So maybe then there's something to be worried about at the product level, which is what I'm trying to argue. And we know that there is likely to be concentration for pain treatment and for blood sugar monitoring. Probably likely to be increasingly interesting to look at respiratory tract infection treatments. And for now, we don't have a problem unless there is some collusion in the digestive health market. So that's the first intuition, first impression, just from looking at the table, right? But this completely ignores what I want to talk about today, is who owns these firms. And it's quite interesting. So we're going to have a quick look at a very brutal, aggressive table.
Antonio, just sorry to interrupt you, but I think could you go one slide back?
This one?
Yes, about concentration. Obviously, you select some areas. I think it would be, especially those days, very interesting to look at vaccines, because there the picture might be perhaps slightly different with more concentrations.
I would love to be able to look at that if I had the data. But when I did this a few months back, and the data that was available...
No, it's just a suggestion.
No,
the other remark is that among the top 10 players, you have only one manufacturer of generics, which is Mylan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that might be an important point of the discussion.
Certainly, when we do the
remark is that I think it's a bit tricky to mix drugs and monitoring devices or systems. I mean, these are completely different products and markets. And
we agree, but the question is whether each one of those products and each one of those markets is concentrated. The main purpose here is to look at within a specific market whether I have a concentration problem or not.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. So let me look at I mean, no, this is the kind of table you get from these reports, right? That tell you this is Fintel, and then I complemented that with the Orbis data with a colleague of mine called Kiefer. So we look at for Novartis, Mylan, for all of these firms, you have two tables. I'm pretty sure you get them if you get the PowerPoint, and you can see. So the only thing that I did is that in the first rectangle that you see in yellow is just to give you an idea of the relative importance of concentration. Again, a very visual stuff. Who owns Novartis? Who owns each one of those companies? And then the second thing that I try to do is to give you a first hint at why I worry about that kind of stuff. Look at BlackRock in orange and at Vanguard in green. BlackRock is owns each and a share in each one of these companies. And I have 20 of them. I mean, I have 18 of them in these tables. And Vanguard is quite active. So you do see that if these firms are supposed to be competing for products, right, there has to be something odd in the way the competition takes place. If companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, or JP Morgan, for instance, have a very strong voice on the board. So that's that's the first sense of a possible issue that you want to think about. And I just translated these two tables into the following table, and it gives you an idea of where BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Capital Group, GOD, Wellington, Norges Bank, and Norway are. And you see that, BlackRock, as I said, is in each and every one of those companies, Vanguard, all but one or two, if I remember. And so fair question is, does it make a difference to see one owner being an owner of all other companies providing products which could be competing with each other otherwise? First question. And intuitively, this is basically what we talk about, right? We have different firms and we have one investor, and this investor owns shares in each one of those firms. So,
Matthias has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this the previous slide is indeed very, very interesting. I must say I was not at all aware of the extent to which these companies that are supposedly competitors have similar owners. To give a bit of background of why these guys, who many of you have never heard of, I bet, are so powerful. It has to do with the fact that you have, in many countries, much less so in Belgium, but in many countries, people have funded pensions, so that there is a lot of money circling around that is yours for your old age, and then this money has to be invested, and finance has taught us that it's a good idea to diversify so as to avoid having a lot of volatility in your future pension. And so these guys, they are in that business. They collect pension money, among others, and then they basically give you a part of the stock market, if you want, maybe focused on some sectors and all that. But then stocks are not only rights for money in the future, but they're also attached to that voting rights. You can, as a shareholder, you're an owner of the company.
I'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Okay, sorry.
But you can continue, and then I'll skip that if you want.
No. But the point is that owning all these things, owning your pension, and in many countries, including the US, these are huge amounts of money. Owning your pension also turns you into the person who can decide who is the boss of the company, and then here the question is, if you own also zillions of companies in the same sector, does that give you additional opportunities? And when you hear about big pharma, You do hear about high prices and all that, but you never, you don't hear much about who is making the decisions. And I guess I think this is really a striking slide, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, frankly, we have 45 minutes, so it's quite difficult to be able to go through each one of those issues.
I'm giving you already an extra 5 because you've been interrupted a lot, and I'm afraid you have another interruption coming. Patrick?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Antonio, very interesting. Obviously, you haven't talked about it, but you know this literature that has developed in the last 5 years on cross-ownership in IO, and in particular, José Azar work.
We talk. That's the main. That comes after this.
Okay, fine. Okay.
So we're fine. That's the main purpose of this presentation.
Okay.
It's always fun to have academic seminars, right? Because everybody has the same ideas. So, okay, the intuition, so is this one, right? You have several firms that are supposed to be competing with each other, and we have one investor getting in there. And the main reason why I worry about that as a regulator is the extent to which it could, limit the potential degree of competition in some markets or some specific products, or and lead to abuses of different types. So that's intuition. And as Patrick was just saying, a few people have been thinking about that since about 2017, and there's some research on these sort of issues. And I'll be basically the rest of the presentation is going to be a synthesis of this kind of stuff. There is a formal definition that goes around, which people use a lot, which is common ownership. So the concept that we're using, right, of this stuff is about common ownership. When one firm invests in when one investor gets shares in different types of competing firms potentially, right? The definition is when there is at least one investor in two companies with an ownership stake of more than 5%. Some papers have decided to take another benchmark. This is the most common one I've seen, and I've seen discussed, for instance, by regulatory agencies in the US and in Germany. So just to get a sense of how much power these people have, Matthias was telling you they have lots of money. This is how much money they have. So BlackRock has about 7 trillion, Vanguard about 6 trillion, and so on. I mean, these are the top 10 asset managers in the world, and the data is for 2020. And just to give you a sense of what this means, the GDP in Belgium is about 500 billion. So it's quite small. And so BlackRock controls assets which are equivalent to the EU GDP. I mean, basically a third of the EU GDP. It's quite significant. So these are people who have a very strong leverage in any type of negotiation. That's what I want to make sure that you keep in mind. So they are big, but does that make them bad? That would be a fair question, right? So the question, in technical terms, I need to translate that into answering the following question: does the size of ownership matter? And so that means we need to measure this kind of stuff. We need to look at whether this is good news or bad news when we see common ownership increasing. And so theory suggests that on the good news, there are a few things that are quite predictable. And there's some evidence also on each one of those issues, not just for pharma. I mean, the survey that I'm providing you with covers a lot of sectors, not just pharma. But there's also a lot of evidence, actually a lot more evidence and a lot more concern about the bad news associated with common ownership. Okay, these are and now that we know these things, right, as a regulator, I would sort of build on this kind of knowledge, and I would start looking at, I would conduct a diagnostic for each one of the products along those lines. So some people do it already. Some regulators start thinking about these sort of issues. For instance, the UK water regulator or the UK electricity regulator do this quite effectively, but it's taking them some time to make the decisions, quite frankly. But many regulators actually don't even look at this kind of stuff. So let me just try to go first through the theory and the evidence, if I synthesize this, in terms of the potential good news associated with common ownership of any type of firm, right, for any type of product, I guess. The CO, the common ownership can improve performance. Why? Because it makes things easier make business decisions easier to organize and to cooperate for. It can lead to positive spillovers across firms in the industry, and it make, again, research a lot easier to coordinate as well. So on the production side, on the and on the research side, you have potential very strong positive outcomes. And I noticed, for instance, I don't know if you saw that Biden administration on March 2nd, which is last week, they decided to broker a deal between Merck and Johnson & Johnson for the vaccine, the coronavirus vaccine. So that's a government decided that we're going to be creating something special that makes two firms work together, because they think it's a good news. You do see good news coming out. But then let's look at the long list of bad news that are coming up. And I categorize them in two groups. There is a risk of wrong management and operation and incentives. So some margin for explicit or tacit collusion. There is a risk of reduced investment in research and development, and Gutierrez and Philippon about 4 years ago already raised this point. As connected firms reduce investment as they face lower incentives to compete. There is a risk of higher prices, margins, and markups we've already discussed, and it's very similar in a way to what you see when you have mergers that take place. There is a risk of lower range of quantity and quality options, and they're all linked to the lower degree of competition. And there is a paper actually that looks at the pharma industry on this one. And then as a regulator, again, I have, I'm telling that I have a bias as a regulator, so I think about the wrong financial management incentives. So it's not just about management and operational incentives, which are very important, which is really what many of the economists looking at these sort of issues and the lawyers also actually have been focusing on. But I think there is a financial management issue that people have to start thinking about. So over leveraging. So what does that mean is that these firms borrow a lot. And there are good reasons for that. I'll come back to that several times, because it allows them to hide excessive returns on equity. There is a risk of overemphasis on dividends. So they borrow or they make profits, but two sources of funding that can be used to pay dividends rather than to invest. So the risk of overemphasis of investment also in intangibles, patents, rather than production capacity, and the risk of creative mergers and acquisition to capture public funding. What do I mean by that? Many of those firms leverage a lot, borrow a lot to be able to acquire small firms when these firms are reaching the stage 3 of the trials for new products. So that their financing actually is basically something which allows them to sort of capture some potential rents associated with much smaller firms. And what you see on the small firms, they know that. And so at the end, when they reach the third phase of testing, for instance, they manage to inflate the potential payoffs in a very brutal way. Anybody working on firm valuation, for instance, for startups, is used to these sort of issues. So these risks are very concrete. And why do I care about them? Because they influence prices, because they influence investment, because they influence quality. I come back to the same sort of issues. And this is the point that Matthias was making earlier also. There's also a very strong risk of these firms being able to basically have a brutal influence on the voting outcomes of the corporate boards. If you're interested in that, there are a couple of really cool surveys that came up in 2019, and in particular, the one by Chiquita in 2020. And an older paper, which I found very useful to look at the insights, but this is a very serious issue. And even if one of the answers, no, but we're not active voters, we're passive players, we're passive investors. And Chiquita is very good, for instance, explaining why, the difference between passive and active is not always that simple, and that passive investors can be quite active outside of the board to influence the board decisions. So there are many more subtle financial concerns that I would care about as a regulator, but again, we don't have enough time to deal with these sort of issues now. But keep in mind this table, because these are the sort of things that I would like to be able to measure as a regulator, for which I would like to be able to have data and access to information that is usually controlled mostly by these firms. Sorry, there is a question.
No, 15 minutes, I was just saying.
Okay, so I can speak faster? No. Lots of good reasons for a regulator to care, as I just said, and think about it. This is to deal with Michel's question. I'm going to make certainly a zoom on any type of product line for which I have captive consumers. For certain types of cancers, you're going to have captive consumers. For certain types of diseases, you're going to have captive consumers. So this is quite important to be able to track that down for those specific products in those specific markets. And also, if you have hidden concentration that sort of seems to be appearing, right, in the design of the market, in the financing of the market, because of common ownership, I need to worry about that as well. For those specific products, I should be worried as a regulator, or if I'm the state, I should be mandating a regulator to be worried about that. because there's a strong risk, basically, that it makes it easier to have coordinated decisions to favor investors rather than investment on the one hand, and hence penalize consumers and taxpayers if subsidies are involved in the process. So the risk of bad news seems to be larger than the risk of good news. But of course, if there is nobody looking at that kind of stuff, maybe the risks are going to be a lot lower if somebody takes the time or is mandated to take care of these sort of issues. So how do we start thinking about those risks? So the first thing is to come up with a measure of concentration. And so that basically means looking at the extent to which the top players control the market for these specific products. The trick is that most of the old concentration measures did not deal with common ownership. And as Patrick was saying, people like, a guy like Hazard put together a bunch of tools that we can rely on. And I'll show you which tool he's been pushing for. But it's quite important to recognize that simply looking at concentration without considering common ownership is going to be a problem. So I need to be able to measure concentration, including the concerns for common ownership. Then I want to think about the financial outcomes, right? Try to think about the extent to which there is a correlation between the outcomes and the prices. And then I want to think about the extent to which these two types of indicators, the concentration and the financial outcomes, are correlated. Ideally, I would be able to establish a causal relationship. At this point, I don't have the data to do this kind of stuff, but there are some people who've been able to do it for some dimensions like research and development and things like this. So there is some evidence of a causal relationship. But again, I'm a practitioner when I think about these sort of issues, and what I want is to be able to provide detailed audits to be able to establish the causality. And we know how to do that actually also in regulation. So how do we measure that kind of stuff? So the old-fashioned way was to ignore the relevance of common ownership. The standard approach was the 4-firm concentration ratio. You basically look at the sum of the percentage of the sales accounted for by the 4 largest firms in the market. That's the basic formula, right? And the closer C4 is to 0, the less concentrated is the industry, and the closer C4 is to 1, the more concentrated is the industry. Very little competition, okay? The most technical one of the fancier version of this kind of stuff is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index that competition agencies have been using more or less, and decreasingly so, I find. It's the sum of squares of percentage market shares of each firm. So, why do we take the square? Because it increases the visibility of the market shares of the large firms. And they come up with a rule of thumb, which again varies from time to time. Below 1,000, when you come, that number varies between 0 and 10,000. Below 1,000, the market share is competitive. From 1,000 to 1,800, it's somewhat competitive. We start worrying about the Herfindahl being at between 1,800 and 2,500, and above that, we know we have a high concentration problem. But again, it puts a number on the table, and it makes it a lot easier to discuss than shooting from a hip and having people saying, I think it's concentrated, I think it's not concentrated. This is something that everybody seems to be agreeing with. Main problem, just to make sure that everybody understands the concept, I just put a couple of slides. Matthias suggested that I do this. So if you look at the market shares and we try to use this information in terms of the concentration index, the first top firms is my CR4. And so my index is 100. It's very close to 100. I probably have a very strong concentration. If I look at the Herfindahl index, right, I will have 2,000, which suggests I do have a potential concentration problem. So the tricky part, the thing that I want to make you think about is the extent to which I add the possibility of considering a common ownership. And one easy way of thinking about these sort of issues is to think about what we know from these basic indicators, what happens when these firms merge. So imagine that firms 4 and 5 decide to merge, right? So basically the market share will change. I have a new firm 4, which now has 10 rather than 5, and this will influence basically the other measure as well. So what you see is that my measures of concentration increase. So any merger will increase my measure of concentration. That's the intuition I would like you guys to remember. And this is the intuition I will have to have when I start thinking about common ownership, because basically common ownership to some extent intuitively is somewhat similar to what would happen when you have a merger, okay? So let's look at what Azar and these people came up in terms of measure to be able to talk about accounting explicitly for common ownership in a measurement of concentration. So they have this thing called the modified Herfindahl. It's composed of two parts: the usual Herfindahl, so the one I just talked about right now, which basically ignores totally common ownership, and then the modified Herfindahl delta. And that's the specific measure that focuses on the extent to which concentration, market power, and the scope for abuses basically can be increased as a result of the presence of common ownership, okay? There's a fancy equation. I'm not going to go through that kind of stuff right now, but you can see that we have a very complex formula that shows us that basically we have three drivers of the Herfindahl in delta. One measures the degree of common ownership. The second one looks at the degree of ownership concentration. And the third one looks at the market power which can be exerted by this increased degree in concentration associated with common ownership. So I can unbundle with a bunch of mathematical type of stuff which are boring at this stage, but which can be quite useful in practice. I can unbundle those things. And the empirical research suggests that that as the delta increases, we are going to have less competitive behavior. That's good news. We have some robust evidence along those lines. So it's basically a very useful tool. Personally, I don't like this tool. I'm working on a paper, a more technical paper also, in which I'm trying to get rid of the fact that the modified Herfindahl index sort of doesn't deal in a very nice way with the fact that you also have owners who are not into common ownership. And so basically the modified Herfindahl seems to be inflating the risk of concentration. And so I'll use this alternative measure also, which gets rid of the possibility that we account for non-common ownership stakes in the market. So these are the outcomes of these assessments. I've put the three measures: the regular Herfindahl, which totally ignores common ownership. I've looked at the modified Herfindahl, which is the standard practice for the last 4 or 5 years in the sector, and then the one that I feel comfortable with because it doesn't deal with a bunch of assumptions I don't feel comfortable with. And so if you look at this table, where you have a sense that of the extent to which, remember I said if we're over 2000, we may have a problem. The column on the right-hand side shows you the two markets where we do have a serious problem of concentration. And the columns on the left-hand side tells you that something is happening in the digestive health market, that concentration, according to the standard indicators, seems to be decreasing, but according to the indicators accounting for common ownership, it's not that clear. So you have a contradiction that takes place between the indicators on digestive health markets. So that's pretty much what you get out of these numbers. So I do get actual measures of the risk of concentration, of the degree of concentration, and I know that our risk associated when concentration increases.
How do you define a market there? Because if you define the market share, you have an idea.
I've computed this for each one of those markets. Basically, so these are the segments in France in which digestive health products are being sold.
Okay, so it's a pretty conservative view of concentration.
It's a very conservative view of concentration. So you could be a lot more worse, right? But I wanted to be conservative in this discussion. Your paper actually offers an alternative to this, by the way. So in sum, basically, the point is that if we do it the way we always do it in competition agencies, or when regulators try to get a sense of how much a market is concentrated, the Herfindahl will underestimate concentration systematically in every one of the pharma products that we've looked at, each one of them. So there is a problem associated with that. At the same time, all three measures for this specific industry argue that to minimize the risk of abuses from excessive concentration of market power, the regulator would need to monitor 2 of those product markets and keep a close eye on the third one. For the first one, we don't have to worry too much. So this is something, again, if I don't know which regulator in the pharma industry would do that, but if you had a regulatory agency the way we have it in infrastructure, this would certainly be part of the mandate or what they would have to do. In pharma, probably this is something that a competition agency would start thinking about, but the competition agency does so many things, right, that nobody, unless you have a complaint or something like that, nothing happens. The advantage of having an independent regulatory agency is that this is their job. This is what they do for a living. And these are the tools they would have to use, okay? So why do we do all this kind of stuff? But because I want to be able to correlate them with a financing decision. I mean, if they borrow a lot, I mean, maybe because they want to do stuff which have nothing to do with the production capacity or the research and development capacity. They're doing it for other reasons, which are quite rational from their perspective, right? To be able to buy smaller companies, which in the long run may be good for health, but also maybe to buy more patents to be able to control the market a lot better and to be able to charge more, or to buy back a bunch of things, which is more complicated to discuss right now. But when, sometimes it's going to be okay, but I certainly want to be able to track down the effect of common ownership on these decisions. And turns out that for a bunch of reasons, actually, we know that the ability to leverage is also an easy way in cost accounting to be able to show that you have a very high return on equity. So, I mean, there's a sort of games that we want to be able to think about. So that's why I want to correlate the evolution of my concentration indicators with the share of assets which are sort of financed through debt and with the return on equity. But that requires data. That requires data. And again, it was quite surprising for me when I started looking at the pharma industry to see how little data you have in comparison to the kind of data I can get in the water industry, in the railways industry, or in the electricity industry. Pharma is different along those lines. The transparency of the data is a lot lower. Maybe because there is a degree of commercial secrecy that people have to comply with. I don't know. But again, as an innocent, as somebody, as an outsider for the sector, to me, it was quite puzzling to see how difficult it was to be able to get access to data. It's weird. It's weird for an industry with such a high social dimension and with such a high level of social risk associated with strategic financing decisions. I'm puzzled by that. The only thing I can do is to report it. And it's really different from what you see in infrastructure. So that's my benchmark. That's what I've been working on for 25 years of my life. So if I look at the numbers that I have, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just what you said, usually when we discuss this with the pharma CEOs or managers, say, but Michel, the problem is the competition between us. We cannot be transparent because then, we want to keep our best talents, and that's, on the other hand, they also work together, but usually this is the answer that we would get to explain.
Right. But now you know that BlackRock, that Vanguard, that State Street, that JP Morgan actually have all the information because they're sitting at the board of all of these companies. So competition, I think the competition argument is an easy one to have, and I think there is some value to it because these guys do compete on some segments. But I just showed you is that you have a bunch of segments on which actually the common ownership makes a big difference to the extent to which competition is limited. Common ownership limits competition. That's what you want to keep in mind from these numbers. And so the argument is not as strong as it used to be in the old days. Not that we can measure this kind of stuff. Maybe 5 years ago we didn't measure this.
Competition in terms of attracting talents, that's why
Yeah, but the ability to, I mean, if I'm the CEO of a company, I'm going to taking bets on which talents I'm putting in which company because I'm making money out of both companies.
Okay.
I mean, it's you name me as a boss, and I will certainly make those decisions talking to the others. So there is an allocation of resources which includes human capital that people seem to forget. Human capital is just an investment, basically, from the perspective of these guys when you think about it in accounting terms. So when I look at the evidence, right, this is what comes out for these markets in France. So the average return on equity for the pharma industry considered as a whole is 35%. The return on assets is 7%. This is 2013 to 2020 average. And you see that the leverage is quite significant. I mean, they borrow a lot, basically. That's what they do. They do borrow a lot. And if I look at each one of the markets, the borrowing story comes up across as well. The debt equity ratio is a bit more subtle. And you see that there is some diversification in terms of the return on equity. For some reason, the blood sugar monitoring sector is not as juicy as some of the other sectors. The pain treatment sector is quite juicy, as you can see. And the return on asset is very low. And this is quite standard, basically. I think the average for the sector, I will show you in a minute, is along those lines. So this is the Damodaran database again, in which I'm looking at these sectors. Again, you have the number of firms. Remember that I only focus on the large firms, which are probably less than 10% of the number of firms, basically, in each one of the drug sectors that I have covered here, right? If you look at the return on equity for the biotechnology fund, it's negative. Why? Because we have tons of startups which are not selling any product on the market. So of course, the return on equity is going to be low at that point. And for the pharma, it's about 10%. So look at the 10% average there and go back to this one for the return on equity.
For your information, we started 50 minutes ago, but you were interrupted a lot.
Okay, I think I have four or five more slides. Okay, so what I want to do now is, sorry?
Can I just ask a question? So the previous slide, so you're talking about returns of equity from 18 to 40%.
I'm talking exactly. On average.
That is huge.
It is huge. It is huge. Look at the number we have on this one.
There is no error, frankly?
We'll double check. Thank you very much for creating a major concern for me. No, I think we checked on the data and it seems to be very high. And it's not unusual. I mean, when you look at the publications on specific pharma industries, you find very high numbers for large firms.
Well, the numbers these are annual returns.
These are your average annual return on equity, yeah.
Because the kind of things, I think we talked about this paper by Andy Lowe and co-authors, that indeed say, look, you beat the market by 2 or 3% for big pharma.
In the US.
In risk adjusted in the US. So in fact, it should be much lower in Europe because in the US,
but that's why these numbers are so
high. So I would be...
We'll double check the numbers.
The risk,
I promise we'll double check the numbers.
Okay.
But if I understand correctly what you said earlier, the assets would include the debt, and precisely they have huge leverage, right?
Exactly. That's what the third and the fourth column show you.
So then the question is, if this is not return adjusted for risk, or yes?
This is not return adjusted for risk, no.
Okay.
Which Damodaran does, by the way, which I don't do because I didn't have the data for this kind of stuff. But I mean, the point is well taken. I mean, we looked at it several times. What I suspect is happening is that the sample size that I have may be too small because I only focus on 10 firms. And maybe I should increase the number of firms to be able to have a big, as you increase the number of firms, basically you get closer to this kind of numbers. But that's why I said I focus on large firms. And the interesting stuff is that when you start correlating that kind of stuff with, these kind of numbers with the modified Herfindahl, for instance, you find somewhat of a correlation, but it's not that clear again for blood monitoring. So I don't know. This is just what the numbers are telling me. But then I start fooling around by computing explicit correlations. And I was worried because, when I look at simple correlations, the correlation only highlight one dimension. They only highlight, they only highlight the correlation of concentration with a debt to equity decision. Then when I do a reasonable econometric model of these sort of issues, something else comes up. So the partial truth that I get out of a correlation analysis can be misleading because when you do a much formal analysis and you control for a bunch of variables, you actually find that the return on equity is correlated with the concentration and that the debt equity and the debt asset ratios actually are correlated with the concentration index, whatever measure you use. So again, my point is that I want to be careful about, I've used it in other discussions, the basic correlation analysis, but when I start worrying about the fact that I didn't see any impact on ROEs, when I was looking at the graph, something was coming up, I did the regression and something else came up on the story, okay? So it's interesting to notice also that we don't find any evidence for an impact of concentration on the return on assets, which sort of fuels my concern about creative cost accounting in this kind of industry. So basically, I think this could be bad news for current patients, future patients, and for taxpayers if the subsidies are not well targeted. So since we are getting closer to the time limit, I have 9 suggested IDs, again, based on my biases from regulation, from infrastructure regulation. But what you see basically is some people, Posner, for instance, argues for simply limiting common ownership. Let's put a cap on this. Another more complicated suggestion is to limit the scope that large common owners have to communicate or to put pressure on managers. Another recommendation that comes up is to regulate the compensation of management, because that will reduce the influence that common owners can have on them. A fourth suggestion that comes out of Posner is to formalize the monitoring of concentration linked to common ownership in a specific regulatory agency, or included in the competition agency mandate more explicitly.
You can breathe, Antonio.
What?
You can breathe.
I'm not breathing. I'm thirsty. And do it better with better tools than the regular Erfindal, which is one of the insights we have from all of this research over the last 4 to 5 years. And then there are a bunch of more technical discussions. I don't know if you want to get into that, but again, which comes from my background, in which we do spend lots of time auditing these accounts. But to me, it's quite surprising that you can have lots of transactions implying a change in key business dimensions that are not notified to anybody. So you have to dig ex post when you have somebody complaining, but increasing the transparency of transactions would make sense. And certainly you would want to know if they make a difference in terms of research decisions and results, if they make a difference in terms of the numbers and the type of patents they get in terms of the type of collaboration that they have. So all of those things for an infrastructure regulator would be reasonable information to be able to require from the operators. And I didn't see that when I start reading about the pharma industry. Of course, there is another decision to limit dividends. In the water industry right now, and electricity industry in the UK, for instance, there is a big debate as to whether dividends should be distributed if the firms have not met their investment obligations. So there is a discussion as to whether we should be limiting the dividends in regulated industry. So that is on the table. The 3 last measures are a bit more tricky and much more detailed. For instance, it would make sense to have a sense of the health impact of the adoption of budget approaches disease with and without common ownership. It would make sense maybe to think about the comparative effectiveness of different types of price regulation with and without common ownership. And finally, to me, it's obvious that when you have common ownership, I mean, the way you think about cost control is likely to be a bit more complicated. I mean, it's going to have an impact on limitation of target population as a margin. For negotiation, it's going to have an impact on how a firm is going to position itself in therapy. It's going to have an impact on the extent to which you can have cross subsidies. All of those things are dimensions that I would think would make sense if you set up a regulatory agency to try to focus on the extent to which this market is evolving in a very clear way, with an increased role of financial actors in the market. So the punchline to me is that it's surprising to see how little evidence on pharma on this dimension there is, how much we have to work with sort of partial information. It's quite puzzling. And this is in an industry in which it's about life and death, about the quality of life. So it's quite surprising. It's very different from what I know. Also, I think there is enough information to be able to make the case for someone thinking about these sort of issues. I mean, I hope that this is what I've convinced you of in this presentation. And if you look at this, I mean, in the academic world, I mean, Azar and people like that, I mean, there have a bunch of people in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in Spain, or in Sweden now, who are starting to put numbers on this. So it's becoming interesting, but not a lot of them are working on the pharma industry. And again, I think it's because data is not as good as it is in some other sectors. So lots of research and policy relevant to be done if you have the patience to dig for the data. Voila, I'm done. Sorry for the delay.
No, we were the ones interrupting, but with good reason, since as expected, that was absolutely fascinating. I don't see people raising their hands. Yes, I see one hand raised, and that comes from Patrick Legros.
Bonjour, Patrick.
Salut, Antonio. So thanks, very clear. I'm very suspicious of all of that, I can tell you, for many reasons. Because imagine that you forbid cross ownership completely. In this thing. You have these big guys, what will they do? They won't diversify anymore. If they want to invest in the pharmaceutical sector, they will pick a winner. So the question I think that has to be asked is what will be the effect on innovation of having basically forcing these big guys to invest only in one firm? So because there could be an argument, that diversification gives more or less a level playing field, allow firms to experiment the market, to experiment on who will be the winner. So that's my first thing. The second thing is that from a competition policy point of view, I agree that being big from a competition policy point of view, if you are big and you have market power and you abuse it, is bad. But here the big guys are the funds. So why nobody has the question of how to regulate these guys rather than regulate what they do?
We agree, no? That's what.
No, you don't want to regulate cross-ownership. Okay, you want to regulate cross-ownership because supposedly the investors who do diversifications are so big that they will have a big foot on the boards of directors, and therefore they can potentially collude or cross-pricing schemes, right? But if they're smaller, I mean, everybody loves cross-ownership. Anybody who invests into the stock market will invest potentially into different firms. The questions are small, so they don't matter. So it's a question of how big the investor is who does cross-ownership. But the big question, I think, is really to understand before going into, this very strong regulatory instruments, to understand what will the counterfactual, what will happen if you force these big guys not to diversify. Will that be good actually for innovation in the pharma industry? I don't know. I don't know at all.
Two things. On the second point, we agree. I mean, that's why I give you the definition on the 5%. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I will cut my sound because I have.
Okay. On the second point first, I mean, yes, I think we agree. I mean, we have to focus on large ones, and that's why I gave you the number of 5%. And most of the debates by Eloga, for instance, in the US are arguing to focus on the large players. On the first question, I think that the main reason why I gave you the good news and the bad news was to talk about what you just said right now. I mean, one of the things that you want is that this is not all bad. And at the end of the day, what you want to do is to look at the extent to which you have different types of outcomes and the relative importance of the different types of outcomes. Most of the research that I've seen focuses on what you say. It's basically, it's a dynamic efficiency story in which you look at the extent to which they're going to be investing in the right thing and providing all the right products that we want to have on the market. But you have short-term costs that you want to think about. And that's what I'm worried about.
I think I'm saying something more. I'm saying, why nobody has the regulation of these financial guys rather than what they do? It's a different thing. So for instance, I just read, in Vietnam, they have been able to eliminate cross-ownership of banks. Okay, whatever. But it's a very easy, it's a much easier problem than. But if these guys, have a capitalization which is of a degree of magnitude larger than states, clearly they have power to do anything they want. I mean, a lot of things. But maybe they're too big to begin with. So it's what I'm.
I don't know. I think, as you said, I mean, we need to have more evidence, which we don't have. But again,
what
bothers me, just to finish, what bothers me is that in the UK, if you look at the website of the electricity regulator and the water regulator, you can see that they're challenging actually these decisions. And so they're looking at the extent to which they could control these players in the market. They haven't found a solution yet, but this is being discussed openly. If I look at the website of the people playing on this turf in the pharma industry, I don't see these debates, and that's what worries me.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk. By the way, maybe there was an old literature in corporate governance that actually Marco Becht contributed to. At the time, it was called pyramids of investors. Mm-hmm. And what they were trying to do is actually was something for people in contract theory was more interesting, is to link the percentage of shareholding to the actual decision rights you have in the firms, mm-hmm. which is something basically absent from the recent literature. The recent literature is very mechanical. You have 5%, you have 5% of decision right or whatever, yeah. Which is, as we understand, probably not right. But anyway, thanks.
Let me remind everyone that if you have a question, you can just signal that in the Q&A. But we have another one now from Matthias.
Well, if I may, I don't want to ask too many, but
you may.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's as I said earlier. I think it is striking to see this ownership pattern, and I think it is indeed a challenging point. What are the implications of that? In terms of if I want to play a bit the devil's advocate, I think that first of all, many of those firms are global firms, and therefore, what will happen in different types of markets, I think is not obvious. Also, because I guess here you have data on their subsidiaries in France, which is only one market, and most probably not the most profitable market. As we know, the US is the most profitable market. So there is a whole question of transfer prices and stuff like that, and also linked to taxation and all these things. So in a sense, trying to understand the impact on competition within the French market is, I think, not so obvious given the data, because these data are indeed influenced by these things. Also, of course, prices are very different in different markets because they are connected to the negotiations within the welfare state, while in the US it may be with private companies or with private insurance companies, or there is this possibility in the US now of setting completely unregulated prices. So one worry I have is, what do we learn about the global common ownership and specificities on the French market? On the other hand, you do show that there seem to be some interesting correlations. So in that sense, I think but it would be nice to kind of see whether this could be driven, for example, by taxation rules and stuff like that, and transfer pricing. The other thing about the role of, is common ownership bad or good? And you did say that there are potential pluses and minuses, but the worst scandals we hear about are neither from these global asset managers, but much more targeted hedge funds and stuff like that. We had this paper with Michel and Alain Fischer about the benefit corporation, showing that and pointing at Danone being an interesting case. Well, the PDG of Danone was just stripped of his CEO-ship. He remains president for now, but he's on the way out. And the people who did that to him are small, aggressive hedge funds. So on the other hand, maybe they got the cooperation from the Vanguard and the BlackRocks of this world, which would be interesting. But somehow being very diversified means that you're typically a longer-term player, and you have less incentive to take the money and run strategies. In fact, you had the pain treatment as one of your markets. Yeah. We did look at it by Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma is not even on the stock market. It's a private company. And I think being really focused on OxyContin gave them an incentive to behave much more aggressively and in a much more critical fashion than I think, well, Johnson & Johnson, they have pain. They invented fentanyl, Janssen Pharmaceutica. And they are sued also, by the way, in the US, but much less so. I think, so in that sense, there is also, by being a more stable company, you have maybe more reputation concerns. So maybe indeed you will push for more collusion and higher pricing on average, but maybe also less really reckless behavior. So I think it would be interesting to try and see whether that kind of thing could be investigated in the data once they are there. So, by the way, one big problem of lack of transparency is that the final price paid by patients and or the state is not the relevant one. This is basically a B2B kind of thing, because these are prices between the companies and the state. So, which I guess are typically, it's not like, of course, I know my electricity bill. So this is a public thing, but what is public in the pharma market is not the relevant one, I guess. So it's normal at some level that it's more complicated, just like wholesale prices on oil. Huh?
Yeah, but that's why two quick reactions. The first one, that's why I mentioned subsidies, because indeed, I mean, the final product is maybe less indicative than it would be for electricity. And so some of the incidence of the market power is on the taxpayers rather than anybody else. And certainly when you think about how much subsidies there is into research and development as well. And the other point is, again, I'm coming back from my sectors. I think we need to measure things. At some point, the theory is great. It gives us all the pluses and all the minuses. But in real life, you're going to have different players in the same sector who behave differently. And you want to measure that. In the water industry in the UK, you have a limited number of players, and the audit takes place for each one of them. And in some of the cases, actually, the board is strong enough not to have to bend backwards to be able to pay more dividends. And for some of the other companies, not. We don't know why, but it happens. And so that's one of the advantages of having a regulator looking at these sort of issues. I mean, to me, I mean, I go back to my one of the points. I think unless you measure, you don't know what you're doing. You have a philosophical discussion, and it's very nice, it's very useful, intellectually very satisfying, but at the end of the day, you don't have any evidence to be able to decide whether this is good news or bad news within that specific product. And whether this specific firm is behaving nicely or not, we don't know that. So that's why I think it's very interesting to see these young people like Azar and all those guys sort of telling us, hey guys, we can measure this thing better, and it makes a difference. So the bottom line is measuring. And if you don't have enough data for measuring, you have to ask yourself, why is the data not coming across? And Michel's comment on the fact that, you know, competition at some point needs to be managed in a different way, because I think it doesn't hold that much anymore. It used to be the case also in the water industry, because you don't have many players and they were all bidding for the same contracts. The same sort of stuff applies, I think, for the pharma industry. All of us want to think that we're different, but in many ways, conceptually, we're very similar when there is market power. The ways of cheating are different, but the fact that you will have an opportunity to cheat is there. It's just, you know, how you do that.
So thank you very much. I think we are coming close to the end. May I ask a last question about public R&D? Because part of the hidden assets, I guess, is all the research, the base research done in universities, which are directly used in these companies. As far as I understand, governments are not sitting on the board of these companies, so should they?
Yeah, I think that's a broader discussion, but I mean, the short answer is yes. And I have one explanation which I care about. So in my class, in one of my classes, I have students do business valuation. So I give them a stock, and I ask them whether I should be investing in those stocks or not. And so this year we had a group that decided to look at a startup. And so obviously the return on equity for that firm is negative, because it's been working on 3 molecules or 4 molecules to be able to address 4 types of diseases, and they're doing quite well. They're in phase 3 of the testing for 3 of these molecules, so they're doing really well. Their stock is at 300 euros. It was about 6 months ago at 240, so the market is starting to believe that they're doing very well. And then when you start looking, I asked the students to look at the cost accounting for those firms. Turns out that a big part of the money of this firm that will be purchased by one of the large ones, because, you know, that's the name of the game, a big chunk of the funding for the last 8 years for this small startup is public money. So at the end of the day, what you see is that, no, R&D is financed by the public sector. And eventually, the payoffs to this R&D is being captured not by the state, the taxpayer, but by the firm. So that's one of the reasons why I would think it would make sense to have a government representative on the board of these companies.
I think that's a very nice way to conclude this very exciting presentation. Thank you again so much, Antonio. Thank you all.
Thank you.
If I can just add one thing on that front. I was struck yesterday, and I think I circulated the paper, the article by to some of you, an article on CNN, who is making money on the COVID vaccine. And that's very interesting, the Pfizer-BioNTech contract. It's 50-50 for BioNTech. So the couple came from Turkey and Pfizer, and that couple is already worth 5 billion euros or dollars. So indeed, for some of them, and a lot of this was, I'm sure, funded with public money.
Yeah, the example I gave you was all EU money, by the way.
Okay.
Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you all.
Enjoy. Merci encore. Au revoir.